And how many of you are members? Just about everybody. Well, if you're not a member, your paid admission tonight will go toward a membership, should you so desire. Your membership will give you unlimited visits to the museum, as well as visits to every speaker presentation that we have, and we try and have a couple a month. So you're welcome to come to those too. So if you'd like to do that, you can go downstairs at the gift shop afterwards and trade in for a membership instead of just a one-night admission. So that out of the way. Restrooms are right down the hall, little housekeeping, 10 feet down, turn left, and you're right there. We do have, like I said, programs coming up throughout the summer. I know we've got one coming up on the local radio station, KSGM. It is one of the very few local radio stations, and it's still owned and operated by a single entity. So that's kind of, you don't hear about that too much anymore. So that'll be coming up later this summer as well. We've got a lot of programs going on. Our newest display, the Rozier Audubon display, we just kicked that off a few weeks ago. So if you haven't had a chance to see that exhibit, we welcome you to do that as well. So all of our programs and the museum itself is all operated through you, through admissions, through donations, through the few grants that we get, and sponsorships. So tonight's presentation is sponsored by the St. Genevieve Museum Learning Center. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to a guy that I've known quite a while, really. You know, it's kind of fun. I always run into him. I just can't seem to get away from him. Gregg's been flying 50 years plus. He started out in general aviation and moved to ultralights, and then the gyroplane took his fancy. So he's going to kind of tell you how that evolved and go through a few other things. So, Gregg Gremminger.
And you also followed me along once we got ultralights.
I did.
I bought an ultralight, and I didn't know it, but she bought one too. And my first birthday present to her was a parachute, a life-saving parachute that you strap on your chest and throw it out if you have problems.
So romantic.
But anyway, what is a gyroplane is, some of you have probably seen these strange looking big bugs flying over town a lot, and everybody's always asked me if that was me, and we've got several other people that are buzzing around town too. A gyroplane is not a gyrocopter. Almost everybody wants to call it a gyrocopter, but the FAA calls it a gyroplane, and there's good reason for that, because a gyrocopter is what Igor Benson back in the 50s kind of designed, invented, and started flying, and it's a brand name. It's like Kleenex. So Benson Gyrocopter has been around, but then there's been a lot of people modifying and making different models of them, and they all looked like that, and that didn't attract me too much. It looked like more of sticks and bones. It's actually a lawn chair that he's sitting on, so it wasn't that much. But I was excited. Those advertisements were on Popular Science, and I thought I could fly off the fraternity's roof. Turns out you can't do that. But anyway, anybody ever have dreams of flying? I think everybody does. Mine are I'm paddling like crazy, and I'm lifting off the ground and going somewhere. And I think that human beings have been doing that for probably a millennia. They look up to the sky, they see the birds, they wish they could do that. And but for I bet even this guy looked up at the sky and wished he could do that, Neanderthal. And then this guy did, Leonardo da Vinci. He tried to figure out how to do it too, and he came up with something that you paddle yourself. I actually wanted to try this sometime, but it's a little bit too much energy for a person to do that. And but he was my hero, and he came up with this ornithopter type thing. And then he also came up with the first helicopter. As you can see, he planned for about 4 guys to be running around there, turning that screw, and it would raise up in the air. Needless to say, that didn't work either, but if he'd had a nice engine, I don't know what he'd have done. He might have been able to do it. And then these guys, they looked up the sky and dreamt about it, but they actually did it. About 120 years ago. So for 120 years out of all the millions of years that human beings have been looking around and wanting to get up in the air, these guys finally did it. You realize what the chances are that we're living in the era where we can actually fly, when for millions of years, probably, human beings have been looking up there and wishing they could do it, and now we're somehow the lucky ones that can do it. So what I tell everybody is, if you have any aspirations to fly, realize how privileged you are to have the ability to do it compared to all those billions of people before, that we can do it now. But they weren't the first. They weren't the first ones to learn how to fly. Mother Nature beat us to it. She came up with this guy. How do you say that?
Quetzalcoatlus.
Quetzalcoatlus. Quetzalcoatlus, you can meet Quetzalcoatlus down in the lower floor, but Mother Nature designed this thing and taught it how to fly, and they could really do it. And that's been 75 million years ago, so somehow they beat us to it. And then this guy, Meganora, is that how you say it? Meganora? 275 million years before. Kind of resembles a little bit like a gyroplane or a helicopter. But Mother Nature took care of it long before we were able to figure it out, but we were out there watching the birds fly, wishing we could do it. Then these guys, back in in the 50s, a group of guys around town, they started a St. Genevieve Flying Club, and the flying club's still going on. A lot of you probably knew Louis Sexar. I met these guys when I was still in grade school. I was sitting up on the Betts Hall Hill with a friend of mine, Ron Dunsey, who happened to pass away a couple weeks ago. But we were sitting up there, and we're riding our bikes up there and sitting on the hill and watching these planes fly right in front of us to land at the airstrip down there, one after another. We got the guts and rode down there and asked them for a ride, and Louis Sexar took Ronnie up, and Joe Glazer took me up, and that got me hooked. I didn't know why Ronnie didn't catch on to it, but that was my first introduction to flying well before high school. And there was 8 of these guys that started the flying club, and they had hangars down there in the big, not the big field, but across from Main Street. They had a fuel farm. And when I built a hangar down there, I dug about 3 foot down to put some posts in the ground for a structure. That's when I ran into the pea gravel where they were. The airstrip is raised that much from river flooding over time. It was farmed in 57. There were 12 charter members, $3 a month, and they rented land from the farmers and had hangars and fuel. But by the 80s, Louis was the only one member that kept it alive, and Steph and I were trying to fly ultralights. And we were flying them out of our backyard out by Zell, but that wasn't as safe as it could be. So we went down to the airstrip, and we talked to Louis, and Louis said, "Well, I'm the St. Genevieve Flying Club, and if you want it, you are now the St. Genevieve Flying Club." So we took over the St. Genevieve Flying Club. And then it wasn't too long after that some of the model airplaners from town, they wanted to fly down there too, so we just started signing up members, whether they were little planes or big planes. Most of the time, for about 20 years, it was just little RC modelers. And right now we do have airplanes and ultralight members and gyroplane members and modelers too. Here's the first airplane that landed in St. Gen. It was flown in 1912, flown by Tony Janis. Bob Mueller gave us some of this information. He was flying where from going to New Orleans, and he was taking some Falstaff down to somebody down there, but he landed up at Little Rock Landing, and they let the kids out of school to go see it in 1912. Wow. You remember that well too, Mike? Okay, what is a gyroplane? Well, it's half of an airplane and half helicopter. The gyroplane has a rotor like a helicopter, but the helicopter has got the motor attached to the rotor, and the motor has to keep going for the rotor to keep going, mostly. And so it becomes very complex mechanically, a helicopter does. A gyroplane has a free spinning rotor. In the air, the motor is not connected to it. It's the air going through it, spinning like a pinwheel, and when it spins fast enough, it's a wing, and we can go fly just like an airplane that has a wing. Once it's spinning fast enough, we have a wing. The air comes through it, the rotor's moving along like that, so the air's going through it, and that keeps it spinning and also creates lift and keeps us in the air. And that spinning rotor disc becomes the wing then. Now, the history of it is way back in early 1920. Juan de la Sierra was a Spanish guy. He and a buddy of his were building airplanes. Airplanes were all new, but in the 1920s, this is after World War I, they kind of knew how to build them, but they were designing and building airplanes. And the story goes, and I'm not sure it's exactly true, but that his buddy was flying one of their airplanes, and it stalled and crashed and killed the guy. Airplanes can stall, gyroplanes do not stall. When this happened, he was so distraught that he swore he was going to design an aircraft, or an airplane, aeroplane they called them at the time, that would not stall and would not be killing people. A stall in an airplane, especially in those early days, and even now these days, is the biggest bugaboo you can have with an airplane. If the pilot's not careful, they can stall the fanciest airplane we've got these days, and they better be good at recovering them. A stall means not that the engine quits. On TV, you always see that, pop, 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 pop. Oh, it stalled. No, it didn't stall, the engine quit. But when the wing quits flying, that's when it stalls, and when the wing is too high pitched like this, it will quit creating lift, and the aircraft has to lower its nose and pick up speed and regain flying speed. But Sierra had succeeded in this. He built some models that he showed how auto rotation worked, and then he built some bigger planes, and he had a whole bunch of models, versions of it. But basically he took an airplane, took the wings off of it, and put a rotor on it instead, learned how to spin up that rotor and make it into a wing and fly it. And suddenly there was a whole lot of unique capabilities of the aircraft. But the critical safety issue for any airplane is a stall spin, especially if you're close to the ground and you don't have time to recover. A gyroplane will not stall. A gyroplane can fly at 0 miles an hour. We can come straight down under full control. When an airplane stalls, it's lost control until you regain control, and hopefully you're not that close to the ground when you do. And then the auto gyros of the time, the 20s and 30s, they evolved, and Harold Pitcairn came to, he bought a license from Sierra to build them in, I think it was in England at first, and then he came over here. And auto gyros, they called them at the time. Basically, he kept wings on it, and you see that the rotor is a wing, but he had little wings on there, and that was just to be able to do controls like an airplane, to roll and pitch. They thought, well, we'll just use that rotor as a wing. Later, they came along. Well, this is some more pictures of auto gyros in the early, in the 30s. This one landed and took off in Washington on the Mall. And they were used a lot for mail between buildings in New York and other cities. They'd fly off of one building and deliver mail to another building. And also, I want to mention Amelia Earhart flew one of these, and at the time she set the world's altitude record for an auto gyro. And apparently she loved it. In fact, I think that picture on the right is Amelia climbing into one. And then in 1939, Igor Sikorsky, the guy that designed the Benson gyroplane was Igor Benson. Well, this is Igor Sikorsky. They were both from Russia. They knew each other real well, but Igor Sikorsky used some of the technology that Sierra and others had developed and made a helicopter. Now, the helicopter could hover, and the rotor was spun by the motor, so the rotor had to keep the motor spinning, and in order for it to continue to fly. But a helicopter could hover, and that had some advantages. A gyroplane cannot hover. It has to have some wind going under and up through the rotor in order to hold altitude. The only hovering we can do is when the wind's blowing about 30 miles an hour, then we can hold it still in the wind. And you can set down like that, and you can lift off like that if the wind's blowing hard enough. But we couldn't do that in a gyroplane or an autogyro, and Sikorsky learned how to do it. But the complexity of the mechanics in the rotor, the engine controls, and you can't see it too well on this picture, but in the back, there's actually a vertical rotor back there, and that's how he controlled pitch. In other words, he can lower the nose and raise the nose, and he had to have another, and it was tilted so that it would counteract torque, and there's all kinds of complications when you have a powered rotor as in a helicopter. But gyroplanes have about 10 times fewer moving and critical parts. They're also much easier to fly because they're in a helicopter, your both feet are busy, both hands are busy, and you can't take any of those off because it just won't continue stably to fly. So a helicopter is much more difficult to fly. A gyroplane is easier than an airplane to fly. I say it's easier than a bike to ride. It's just intuitive, and you don't have to work real hard to do it. But 10 times fewer moving parts means a lot to me because I worry about those parts. In helicopters and sometimes in airplanes, but in gyroplanes too, everybody's wondering how many Jesus bolts does this thing have? That's a bolt that if it fails, you're going to see your Savior. So there are probably 30 or 40 Jesus bolts in any helicopter. We have maybe 2 or 3, and they are over-designed in most gyros. There's never been failures on those. They're over-designed by at least a factor of 10 in most cases. So there's never been a failure with rotors or Jesus bolts or anything with gyroplanes. There was a guy that was building 4 or 5 of his own design, and he was doing them all at the same time. He forgot to put a safety pin in his rotor bolt, and the rotor did fly off. But that, I don't say that was the gyro's fault, that was his fault. The helicopter on the left and the gyroplane on the right, they look a lot the same. These are both 2-blade rotors. Most gyroplanes are 2-blade rotors. And the helicopters have, and airplanes have several critical issues that a gyroplane doesn't have. In a helicopter, I said you need the motor connected, you need the motor running all the time to have that rotor spinning. But if the motor quits in a helicopter, they have an out. They disconnect the rotor from the engine, and then it becomes a gyroplane, and they can fly it to the ground. So a helicopter becomes a gyroplane if the engine quits. A gyroplane is always in auto rotation, it's always a gyroplane, it can land and fly and doesn't depend on the engine at all. And if you lose the engine, you are coming down, but you're under full control, you can find a good place to land. And these are some examples of some gyroplanes and gyrocopters. Now on the bottom, these I would call gyrocopters. They're evolutions of what Igor Benson did. Basically, there's something you can tell different from these. They don't have big horizontal tails in the back like these do. These two here were developed in the 50s and 60s, and they are able to connect the engine to the rotor and spin it hard enough to jump off the ground and then start flying. They're not helicopters, but they actually have as much complexity in their mechanics as a helicopter. So they really never made it, because if you want a gyroplane to jump off the ground, why don't you just get a helicopter? It's probably simpler. But these have a lot of moving parts. The gyrocopters on the bottom don't have big horizontal stabilizers, tails in the back. The red one over there, that's the first gyrocopter I ever had. That's not mine, but I had one just like that. And those designs, especially one like this one on the left, were more difficult to fly. They weren't stable. They weren't easy to fly. You had to learn to do it. The pilot had to be the stabilizer on it. And most of that was because they did not have big tails way back. Then comes along Vittorio Mani and Jukka Tervamaki. They're over in, Jukka's in Finland and Vittorio's in Italy. And they both realized that to make a gyroplane, auto gyro they call them, stable, you had to put a large horizontal tail on. You can't hardly see the horizontal tail. There you can see one. That one's way back there. There you can see that horizontal tail, and that one over there. But when you put that a big horizontal tail back there, we call it a big tail way back. I invented that terminology and everybody uses it now, BTW and I had a t-shirt for that, but it's embarrassing to wear much. But the design started realizing we can make it much more safe, stable, and easier to fly, easier to pilot if you have a big tail way back. And some of the models have gotten pretty unique. Some of them look like they don't even belong to the Earth anymore. But all of them will have a big tail way back that makes them easy to fly, hands off, feet off. It will fly stable. You don't even have to fly it. All you have to do is tell it when you want to do something different than what it's doing. And one of the most common questions we get is, how high can a gyro fly? Well, this lady here over in Italy about 10 years ago went to 27,000 feet. Donatella Ricci. 27-something thousand feet in an M16, Magni M16 like this, which is what you see flying around here. That's the most popular model around here. 27,000 feet is pretty high. Now, she was dressed for it, and I'm not sure that they didn't tune the engine a little bit different. But she set the altitude record. For us, I don't know, Hank, John, how high have you guys been? 10,000, 15,000? 12, 11,000?
Pretty small like that.
Yeah, I took my little gyrocopter up to, I think, 14,000 feet one time, and I get nervous up there because I don't even know, can't feel I'm flying. I'm just sitting there, and the Earth's going like that, so in front of you. But one time, me and some buddies got kind of caught coming back from the Badlands up north. We were trying to get home before a storm came in. So we decided the wind was much better at about 12,000 feet. This was summertime, and we left the ground in shorts and T-shirts. And we stayed up there about an hour, and finally we gave up, said we're going to have to get down a little lower. This is too cold. And we didn't beat the storm either. And then how far can a gyro fly? Well, the ones that we've got around here, we can probably fly 250, 300 miles if we're pushing our gas, which is pretty good. But now this guy, James Ketchell, flew around the world in 175 days. He did that in 2019. He started in England. He's British. He started in England and went across Europe and Russia, over into Alaska, came down to the States, and then instead of going straight across the States, he kind of weaved around to hit as many states as he could, and stopped at a big convention up in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, where we got to meet him. And then he took off from there and flew around New England to show off a little bit, and then crossed over Greenland and Iceland and on back to Scotland and Britain. But he's quite an adventurer. He also one time, what did he do? Row a canoe across the Atlantic? Yeah. Rowed a canoe across the Atlantic. Mike, would you do that? No. You almost did this past year.
Pretty far.
Yeah. Okay, I do want to mention a couple of guys. I did mention Jukka Tervamäki in Finland. He and Vittorio Magni were had Benson gyrocopters. They were enthralled with them. Jukka is a trained aeronautical engineer. He's was a professor at the University of Helsinki in Finland, and he worked early on with Igor Benson over here in the States and learned about the gyrocopters at that time. But he went back, being an aeronautical engineer, he realized they had to have tails on them, and Igor Benson didn't believe in tails, so he believed that the pilot could do it. But Jukka figured they needed tails, and there was a bad accident in Britain at the air show at Farnborough one year. It was in a kind of a Benson copy, and it was a bad accident due to the instability of that gyrocopter. And that really shook up Yucca because that was the thing he wanted to promote: gyroplanes, gyrocopters, autogyros. And so he wrote a letter to both the CAA in the U.S. and the FAA in the U.S. and CAA over in Britain, and just said, you need to require horizontal stabilizers on these things, or you're going to keep having that. Well, the FAA and CAA in their wisdom wrote them back and said, oh, these are experimental, they can do anything they want. They're supposed to be, the FAA and CAA are supposed to be concerned about safety, and they just basically said, we don't care about you. But so he went and designed with several iterations, and he played with tails. He put V tails on them and T tails on them and all kinds of stuff. Basically ended up with this model called the JT5, Yucca Turvamaki 5. And you can buy plans for that yet, and it's well appreciated little single place gyroplane. But anyway, he promoted that. He was a designer also for, he would design and build fiberglass gliders, big professional glider planes. And so he knew a lot about fiberglass, so he designed the rotor. The rotor is fiberglass on all the Magnis now. Well, Yucca and Vittorio Magni down in Italy, they became friends doing the same kind of things, and Yucca basically sold Vittorio the rights to his rotor and to the JT5 and things like that. And Vittorio in the 60s with his two sons, he took his two sons, Luca and Petro here, flying, they would be strapped on his lap in a little gyroplane. And he made all kinds of different designs, and then between Vittorio and Yucca, they designed together, and then they called those MTs, Magni Turvamaki, and ran up the numbers. We have when Magni started doing it all on their own without Yucca, they changed it to just Magni. They sold a bunch of them. Magni sold in the 90s sold a bunch of gyroplanes in Britain. Didn't have a very reliable engine, and they tried to get a more reliable engine, which now we have a much more reliable engine. But they were struggling as a family. Now their family is, I think it's 29 people right there. It's not all their family, but when you can go over there and build it in their factory and party with them, and I did a lot of partying with those guys. They'd go out. For lunch when you're out flying, they'd have wine on the table, cheese and wine and crackers on the table. It was Italy. But anyway, Vittorio and Yucca helped promote the design of safe and stable gyroplanes, and that's what we fly today. And then there's some other questions, unless Hank or John, you got any interesting questions I can answer?
How fast do they go? That's what I get. I get that a lot. How fast do they go?
Well, they can go 100, 120, 110, 120 miles an hour. Some people fly even faster than that, but there are some technical reasons why not to go too fast. On smooth air, you can do that. But typically, they'll cruise. Some of the models have smaller engines between 85 and 90, or the bigger ones will go 90 to 100, and the bigger engines yet can go over that 100 to 110. That's cruising. And so you can go a long ways. At 100 miles an hour, you can cover 250, 300 miles in pretty short order.
So most people are flying around the world, but how far do a lot of people fly when they're just, I mean, obviously you're not going to be stuck just around the airport. So like, how far do you go?
Well, we've taken trips with me and some buddies. We've been to California, up and down the coast, going by LA and down past San Diego. And we've been out to Maryland, to Chesapeake Bay, and down to Florida, down to Texas, and up in the Badlands. But you guys are doing that all now. How far did you fly?
We went to the Grand Canyon and back.
Grand Canyon and back?
Back and forth to Florida 3 times.
Yeah.
You have to. You went back and forth. Not
Yeah.
California.
Now these are not commuting aircraft. These are fun recreational aircraft, and when you take a trip like that, it's kind of an adventure First of all, you got to figure out how to pack enough stuff to be gone for days at a time.
Motorcycle.
And then you need to stop in decent places to get gas and sleep sometimes. But there's stories about where we've had to stop and get gas and outrun storms and things like that. First time, nobody from the FAA is here, right? First time we flew out to California, a guy named Paul Salmon was down in Cape Girardeau, and he was flying helicopters and gyros, but there was about 4 of us took off from here. We were going to go across the Grand Canyon and down to into California. And he was buying a helicopter out there, so he wanted to go into California on the coast. So we went there, and he was leading us through there. LA, the basin of LA is just full of control zones, and you don't want to wander into any of them. They're all under control, and you're on radar. And so you don't want to, you need to know what you're doing. Now, Paul knew what he was doing because he spent time out there flying helicopters around for TV channels and stuff in LA. So he's leading us in, we land, we talk to some friends, and we take off, go down to San Diego, and then we're heading back up. He says, well, I need to go stop over at Torrance again. That's out on the coast. He said, let's go out to Torrance again. I want to see them. So we're heading up, and I'm watching the map, and I'm thinking, we're going that way, and Torrance is there, and it's getting there and there. I said, Paul, where are you going? I thought you were going to Torrance. He said, well, we're going to take the long way around. He said, do you ever see Staples Center from the air? I said, I don't think I did. Where's Staples Center? He says, downtown LA. I said, Paul, we can't go there. We're not helicopters. He said, well, there's a helicopter tour route through there. They let helicopters fly there. 150 feet up is LAX. You can't go there. And some of those buildings are almost 150, up to the base of the LAX. So we're flying in, and me and a buddy, we're looking down there. There's 8-lane highways, and they're all full, and there's nothing but buildings, no place to land. I said, Paul, where are we going? He says, well, we're going to go see Staples Center. And pretty soon he says, there's Staples Center. And we're looking down. My God, we were right over LA, downtown LA. A buddy of mine says, well, we're already in trouble, and I'll never get to do this again. So he flew between buildings in LA. And then out. We went out to see the Hollywood sign and down, the hills? But
Beverly Hills. Malibu.
Yeah, Beverly Hills, and then up by Malibu and the pier. And we were able to wave at people on the Ferris wheel on the pier out there. And so when we landed at Torrance, he circled back, went down the coast, and he said, just stay over the water while we're heading down there. You'll be okay, but don't go above 150 feet. So we landed, and I said, Paul, you're never going to do that again. Don't do that to us again. I was afraid there was black helicopters after us anyway. Well, nobody came to get us, so we get ready to go, and we lead out. And I said, Paul, don't do that to us again. We're heading out and enjoying the scenery, and I look down, boy, that's an unusual bunch of, that's Disneyland. You're not supposed to fly over Disneyland. So I took pictures, but I don't show those too often around. Anyway, what kind of fuel? We use auto gas mostly. You can buy the expensive aviation gas, but we usually use premium auto gas. We can stay in the air probably 3 hours, and there's several engines we use. I don't know if anybody's heard of Rotax, but they make Ski-Doos, and they're just big on it. They provide the engine that some of us are flying right now is flying in the Predator drone for the Air Force. And now they've come out with more. So the engines run from 100 horsepower to 115 horsepower to 140 something horsepower. And now they're coming out with 160 horsepower. So we've got a lot of horsepower, and the engines are getting more modern. They run off of computers. It's just like your car. So when something goes wrong, just like your car, you don't know what went wrong. You got to pay somebody to figure it out. The aircraft will probably weigh fully loaded somewhere around 1,200 pounds. New ones, at least this brand, this is probably the least expensive brand out there, but they're probably running in the 100,000 now. When I started, I bought my first one for I think 28,000. That's been a few years back. And licensing, you can fly them as a sport pilot which is the simplest way to get a pilot's license. It takes less time, required time, but for a gyroplane, most people will fly as a sport pilot. Especially if you're already a pilot, it's real easy to fly them. But we've got several people just learning. I've taught a lot of people that learn from scratch, and that once they get 5-10 hours going, they're getting pretty good. And landing is the thing you spend most time on. Taking off doesn't take long for them to learn, and just flying it, I've turned it over to 9-year-old kids, and they've found their home out in the country on their own. So it's easy for anybody to fly. They can take off. Typically, they'll take off in about 300 feet. Depends on if you're on grass or on a concrete runway, it's different. But they can take off in about 300 feet. But you can land somewhere between 25 and 50 feet, even if there's no wind. If there's a little bit of wind, I'd say 15 to 20 mile an hour wind, you land into the wind, you don't hardly roll. I really like to show somebody that if the wind's strong enough that I can land and the wheels don't turn over once. So it's almost like a helicopter at that point.
Are you like an airplane? You fly into the wind when you take off?
Yeah, you fly into the wind when you take off, and you land into the wind. Yeah. Now, if it's a lighter wind, it doesn't matter. But all that really does is lengthen the time and speed that you're rolling on the ground before you can lift off. So if you want to stop in a short order, if you had to land somewhere, you just make sure you're landing into the wind, and that'll be the shortest landing you can make and slowest landing. It's kind of unique that the shortest and slowest landing, really then the safest landing you can make, is when the engine quits in these things. It's not true in an airplane. I mean, an airplane, you've got to be moving a little bit to get it on when you touch the ground, and so you're going to bounce across rough ground or run into the fence on the other side of the field or something. But in a gyroplane, if the engine's completely dead or down to idle, you can land that's the way when you can land the slowest and the shortest. So it's kind of good, because if the engine quits, I want to land as short and slow as I can in that little field down there. In my original gyrocopter, that red one I showed you, I had 3 complete engine failures. They all happened to be in the fall. That little engine that I had on there wasn't very reliable. It would get about 150 hours on it and throw a bearing or something. And so I had 3 complete engine failures and landed in freshly plowed cornfields and never hurt the gyro except the engine. And the biggest problem with that was getting it out of that dang plowed cornfield on a trailer. Especially the little ones, you could land them very slow and very short, and basically you just pull up to a stop and a few feet off the ground and let it drop, and it'll handle that. Now, just some tidbits to finish it up here. Back in 2000, I think it was, wasn't it, Steph? This is 2001. Yeah. Oh, it was just before 9/11. We were up at the Experimental Aircraft Association's convention in Wisconsin, and we had that gyroplane up there. And a lot of people saw it. It was the first time they'd seen that thing, and we won the award or something up there too. And we get home, get a phone call a week or so later. The guy says he's from Popular Science, and we'd like to use your picture of your gyrocopter on the magazine. And Steph, being in communications and stuff, she said, "Oh, this is a scam. They're just darking us." So we didn't believe it. I think we listened to a message or something, and then they called back, and she talked to them for a while. She said, "I think this is for real," and it was for real. They wanted to put us on the cover of Popular Science. Now they said, "Can you find a helicopter?" They wanted to hire a helicopter, and we went up to Creve Coeur and we flew along the Missouri River in formation with a helicopter guy. Photography, they hired a professional aviation photographer, and he's hanging out of the helicopter, and the pilot's telling us what to do and stuff. So they've got a lot of pictures, and they called us back and said, "Oh, the pictures are great, but we got a problem. We're also sending a photographer, our camera, up in the shuttle. And if they get some good pictures in the shuttle, those are going to have to go on the cover. So we thought, oh man, we lost out. They called us about a week before they published, said, you won. The shuttle pictures weren't any good. You're on the cover. So we made the cover of the Popular Mechanics. And then Commander Ken Wallace over there, he was big in England. He's designed and built so many. He's a retired military, British Air Force, I guess. And he's built a lot of gyroplanes. He's the one that built Little Nellie for the James Bond movie. I think it's You Only Live Twice. Of course, in the movie, he pulled a suitcase out of the trunk and then assembled that gyro there. But notice it's got rockets and guns and stuff on it, so they had a dogfight in the movie. But Ken Wallace designed so many. He did perform a lot at air shows and stuff. And so he's a big name in gyroplanes. And we got to meet him one time at the convention over here. Well, that's what I got. If anybody else anybody have any questions or curious? Yes?
Have they ever used carbon fiber composites to make these things?
Almost all of these are carbon fiber now. Carbon fiber got much cheaper about 10 years ago, and so almost everybody's using carbon fiber now. And the rotor blades on these Magni gyroplanes some of it's fiberglass. I think there's some carbon fiber in it for strength. And there's some advantages with using carbon fiber and composite materials. It doesn't crack and fatigue and things like that. And it's repairable if you ding it up.
Does Magni sell an air combat package?
We can ask them.
You haven't seen the Gatling gun I've designed for it? I want to put a Gatling gun on the front of that. One time, about 3 of us are flying off to a convention or something, and there's certain airspace that's dedicated for military flying. And it tells you on the charts, you've got to stay below this level or watch out careful in this area for military aircraft practicing. Well, we were at the minimum 500 feet off the ground and flying along, and here come 2 Warthogs, A-10s, flying out. And we see them off in the distance, and they fly around us up high and circle a couple of times, and then one of them comes around and he's pointing right at me. And I'm thinking, I want a Gatling gun to fight back. But I think that would look cool to have a pair of guns on the nose.
What kind of radio communication do you carry?
Same as any aircraft, regular aviation networks. We also have navigation stuff and transponders. And the electronics, the technology for all that has made it so much easier. Back when I was flying the little red gyro copter, I was using a map, a chart, the same chart you use in a cabin, but I'm out in open air, and I was using that to fly places. And that's the way I was taught to fly, so that's why I'm going to do it, And then they came out with GPS. It wasn't really very, very good. Steph bought me one. It was a marine GPS, and you had to plug in the lat long and stuff like that, but it would draw a highway, and you stay on the highway, and you're going to get where you're going.
And your points were MOAs, man overboard.
Yeah. I'd fly along. There was a button on there for man overboard, and if you press the MOA button, it would mark that spot on your GPS. So if you're flying in rain or storms and you don't know how much further you can go, when I'm over an open field that I could land in, if I needed to, I would press the MOA and I'd fly on. So if something happened, I'd just fly back to where the GPS told me. Now, I kept arguing with you shouldn't have got me that. I don't need that. That's for wusses. We don't need this fancy stuff. Well, until I started using it, and then I liked it. Nowadays, the aviation GPSs will just take you there, and you can hook them up to an autopilot if you want. Takes the fun out of flying, but they'll take you. They tell you how far you're going. They can tell you what time you're going to get there. Just anything about it. They'll tell you how high you are, how fast you're going across the ground, and now there's a technology that they've come up with that shows you on your GPS screen. It's just a map screen where other aircraft are around you. It tells you who they are and how high they are. Are they 100 feet above you or 1,000 feet above you? So it's just amazing. And then it'll start alarming if it looks like somebody's going to be coming at you. It'll start alarming you. The only problem with that is the FAA knows everything about you. So you got to keep it straight or turn that thing off. But so the technology is just amazing. It's hardly any work to plan a flight to go somewhere. You're punching it in as you drive out on to the runway. And for years in ultralights and light planes and gyroplanes, the technology that we had, because we're all experimental and we can do things that the certified aircraft can't do and that the airlines can't do. We had airline pilots flying with this technology and gyroplanes that I said, I wish I had this in my DC-3 or whatever. Yeah.
Could you describe the controls that are in the cockpit and how you would use them in taking off or landing or turning left or right?
Sure. Well, the basic controls, it has what we call a cyclic. It's a joystick. If you move the joystick to the left, it starts rolling. Now, if you keep it to the left, it just keeps rolling. But once you get to the bank angle that you want, and that's how you turn. You bank it. You move the joystick to the left, or the cyclic to the left. It banks, and you start turning. You move it right, left, and that's how you control roll.
And because it's turning the tail.
No, it's not turning the tail. The tail is not moving. We control the tail with our feet, but we don't need to use the tail. It's not the tail that steers an airplane or a gyroplane. It's the banking. On an airplane, you have ailerons out on the wings, and when you move the ailerons, it'll bank the aircraft. And when it's banking, it's like a car going around a racetrack. It's turning, because part of the lift that was lifting up when it banks over is pulling you that way too. So the same thing in a gyroplane, left and right will bank it, and you bank it to the angle that you want. The steeper the bank, the tighter the turn. And if you're just tracking a course on the GPS, it's just barely moving it at all to just point the aircraft along the GPS line. But that's how you control roll. That's how you steer it in the direction you want to go. Now, moving the joystick or cyclic forward and aft, moving it forward in an airplane or a gyroplane, same thing, it lowers the nose and you go faster because now I'm going a little bit downhill. And if you pull the cyclic back, it raises the nose, and now you're going uphill, which is a little slower, so you're slowing down. So the fore and aft is faster, slower. Faster, slower. Now you have a throttle on the engine, and that engine basically controls how high you're going to go. If you need to climb, you use more power. What do you do in a car? If you got to go uphill, you got to press the gas pedal a little more. So you give it more power to go uphill. If you're going downhill, if you reduce the power, you're going to be descending. So the power is your altitude control. The stick fore and aft is your speed control, and sideways is holding the direction or turning as you want to turn. Now the rudder on an airplane is fairly important on an airplane in the air. The rudder on an airplane corrects for what they call adverse yaw. Even the Wright brothers discovered this, which is why they put rudders on their original flyer. If you turn an aileron down like that and this one up like that, well, there's more drag on this one, so the aircraft goes, and that's called yaw. This is yaw. This is roll. This is pitch. So you have those three different controls, and the rudder controls yaw. So now in an airplane, when you go to make a turn, you put some elevator in one side and the other side, well, that's going to yaw the aircraft. And you have to use the tail to keep it flying straight. Now, it's not real necessary, but if you get real extreme, that is what can cause that stall spin that you can get into in an airplane. So your feet are pretty working a little bit in an airplane. On the ground, all the rudder pedals are for steering mostly. They steer the nose wheel, or they'll also move the tail. So some aircraft don't have steerable nose wheels, and so you have to give it some rudder in the back, and that'll turn it on the ground. So basically the rudder pedals are for controlling the direction it's going. On the ground, if you hit left rudder pedal, it's going to turn that way, or right rudder pedal. In the air, hit left rudder pedal, it's going to turn that way, or right pedal that way. So those three directions of movement, pitch, roll, and yaw, are controlled just the same as in an airplane. And power will either let you climb or descend, and if you want to stay level, you set it to the right power that keeps you level. You have altimeters and stuff, tells you I'm flying level, so there's my power. I can take my hand off the power, it stays there. I can take my feet off, in a gyroplane, I can take my feet off the rudders because we have none of these ailerons out on the wings. What we do is we have this disc that we tilt, and it doesn't have anything like adverse yaw, so you don't need the rudder in the air. The aircraft flies by coordinated. It flies coordinated means that you're flying straight into the wind. You're not flying this way into the wind or sideways into the wind. So the controls are basically the same thing as an airplane. However, it won't stall, it'll land slower, and it'll take off shorter.
Are the controls for the rotor, or is it just on its own?
Yeah, when you move the cyclic stick, it's actually moving the spinning disc rotor, tilting it all around. So you're tilting your wing, which in an airplane is what you're doing. You're tilting your wing. But in a gyroplane, the rotor, and in a helicopter, the rotor is the wing, and so your cyclic control moves the rotor. Now, there's some physics that goes with it. Gyroscopic precession and all that enters into it, but I won't get into that. But that's basically when you move the stick forward, the rotor disc moves forward, tilts forward. Move it back, rotor disc tilts up, just like the wing does when you do the same thing in an airplane.
Go ahead.
Greg, I know you have auto rotation on your whatever.
The rotor is always in auto rotation.
Right. How do you start that rotation?
Well, we have a pre-rotator. You can see a little black thing. I'm standing too much. This little cable back here is connected to the engine, and it basically, on the ground, you get the rotor spinning.
Okay.
Now, the little gyrocopters, like my first one and stuff, well, no, I had a pre-rotator, but a lot of people would stand in the seat, spin it, hop down in the seat, buckle up, and run down the runway, and put air through that rotor, and it speeds up and speeds up and speeds up.
So the faster you go on the ground,
Right. The more air you put through the rotor, the faster it goes, and pretty soon it's wing. So the takeoff procedure is to pre-rotate it. We go to about 220 RPM. It'll fly at about 300.
Okay.
So we go to about 220 RPM. Then we don't depend on it. We disconnect that. It's got a bendix up in the top, like your car starter bendix. It disengages completely. Now the rotor's free spinning, and what's spinning it up is the air going through that rotor. The more air you put through it, the faster it goes. More air you give it more air, the faster it goes, and pretty soon it becomes a wing, and now it's ready to fly. And in the air, you don't have to pay attention to it. In a helicopter, you got to pay attention to that.
And I guess you have a tack that you understand what your rotation speed is.
Right. We have a rotor tack, but all that's doing is telling us that we're ready to fly.
Okay.
In the air, you don't pay attention to it.
Right. Yeah.
There's an interesting thing that happens every time I fly. I bug Steph about this. Is just a miracle. I can't believe Mother Nature did. And Mother Nature did it all. Gyroscopic precession and auto rotation and all that. In a gyroplane, in an auto rotating rotor, the more load it's carrying, the faster it spins. Just automatically. Mother Nature does that. Less load, the slower it spins. It spins fast enough to carry the load that you're asking it to carry. So you got two 200-pound guys in there. If one hops out, this rotor spins slower. But if you go into a bank and pull back on a stick, you're actually pulling G's. You're creating more than 1 G of gravity, and the rotor speeds up. And the harder you turn, the more the rotor speeds up. And what happens to that high-speed rotor when you get turned around and level out? It's more like a helicopter. So that's why we can land so slow. We can come down at about 60 miles an hour, and when you get close to the ground, you flare, which means you're getting heavier in the seat, the rotor's spinning up, and now you're a little bit of a helicopter for 2 or 3 seconds, and it'll slow way down.
What is your maximum payload that you can carry?
somewhere around 600 pounds. And the aircraft weighs somewhere around 600 pounds, depending on the engine. We've got a big, heavy engine now, so
Yeah.
we push it a little bit more because it'll do it.
Sure.
Yeah.
It really will carry whatever you put in it. It just depends if you have enough runway.
Yeah. At conventions,
You can shoehorn it in there. Really.
at conventions, instructors are giving rides or selling training lessons. That's all we can legally do. And so at conventions that we went to for years, when a heavy guy comes up to somebody, they'll say, go see Gregg, go see Gregg. Well, if they're really heavy, I'll say, let's do it in the morning when the air's cool and I'll have more lift. But if they're really big, they said, well, we're going to see if you fit in the seat. And then I show them where the stick has to be in order to take off. So I'll hold it forward and let loose of it back hard. If they don't yell too loud, then we'll go fly. So yeah, you can load them up pretty good. All aircraft, especially these two, they have a structural safety factor of at least 3 to 1 safety factor.
What's the largest gyroplane that's ever been made?
What do they call that? Aerodrome? Huh?
Yeah.
It was an airline size
Ferry, is it ferry?
aero ferry, something like that.
Like that, yeah.
And this is in the
RV-1.
50s or something. What did it have? It had a rotor on each wing or a rotor in the front and back?
It had one big rotor.
One big rotor, yeah. And then it was jet powered, I think, and it was Ferrydyne. It was airline. It had seats and cockpits and stuff. It never really made it successfully, but it flew. There's pictures on the internet. Look for big gyroplane, and you'll find it. Yeah.
One is the rotor that's right behind the motor. Is that
That's the propeller. That's the engine.
forward?
That moves you forward so that you get air going through that rotor and keeps it spinning. Now,
Rotor itself, does it tilt any?
no, the blades are fixed blades and basically flat.
But they move this way.
Yes, you can. Well, yes.
From a
The rotor disc moves like that.
Yeah.
The blades move in a funny way, and then I have to start explaining gyroscopic precession.
But they
Rotor
don't-
dyne, yeah.
They don't turn or,
No, they're fixed, and that's why in a helicopter they do that. And if the engine quits and you're flying along like that, you got to real quick do that. You got to make it a gyroplane. If you don't make it a gyroplane, the rotor gets too slow and you're done. Yeah, well,
Can you theoretically roll one of those things 360?
theoretically, you have to maintain positive G's. People do that, and we don't like to tell people they do that. But you can go on the internet and you'll see guys doing loops and barrel rolls. You can't do a point roll because now you're upside down. You can't get upside down with them. But if you do a barrel roll, you can maintain some positive G's, and people shouldn't do that. Airplanes can do it, gyroplanes can't. Not safely.
now get what's the cost of one?
Well, the latest models like that one on the left are probably in the 100,000 range. And there are some of those that I showed you earlier, probably pushing 200,000. 250,000? Some of them from Europe.
They had at Sun Fun, they had a autopilot Catalan that was 280,000.
Oh, wow. That's too much.
It's ridiculous.
See, Magni and we like to keep it simple.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes it's hard to keep it simple because everybody really loves all this electronics, and they'll put 2 of these $10,000 units in it. And when I first started flying, we flew ultralights and first gyroplanes, gyrocopters. We had an airspeed indicator and a well, it was actually one of these that you hold up to see what the wind is, a wind indicator. And I think we had a cylinder head temperature gauge, something like that. You don't keep it simple is what you do. Now, if you're going to use it for traveling, it's a good adventure traveling machine, and it's nice to have all the electronics then.
But you can get them for half that use.
Do it.
You can get them used for about half that.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of them come up on the market all the time. There's some that are going for half that price, and they're not that old. Most of them like this, and what these guys have, the engines have got 2,000 hour recommended overhaul times on them. That's a lot of flying. And propellers and rotors are similar to that. So that's a lot of flying. I've never kept one more than maybe 800 hours. Sold it and started over.
Is it very costly to overhaul one and go through the maintenance thing like you do an airplane? It's a great question.
Well, yeah, to overhaul that engine is expensive.
To the point prohibitive to have. I had a son that's going to give him an airplane, and he said, I can't afford to keep it.
Yeah. Well, the maintenance on them, which you have to do annual maintenance, on these is very simple.
Yes.
There's not that much. I mean, you can do an annual inspection in a day. It's just check some tension and bolts, do a compression check on the engine, and these engines are fabulous engines.
Compared to an airplane, it's much cheaper.
Oh yeah, compared to an airplane.
Annual maintenance.
Annual. And if you were to build it and be the builder of record, you don't have to pay anybody to do anything. You can do it all.
It is with gyros, the cheapest parts, or the most expensive parts buying it. With an airplane, the most expensive parts.
Keeping it. Yeah.
And the overhaul, the typical recreational pilot doesn't fly like these guys. I mean, these guys put on 400 or 500 hours a year. The typical recreational pilot may fly 100 hours a year, and that's a lot. So that $1,200 or 1,200 hour engine overhaul, it'll be 10 years in the
Yeah.
future. So.
The one we've got is a newer engine. It's only got a recommended TBO of 1,200 hours, but these others are 2,000 hours. And we've run them, and that's just recommended. We've run them. Paul had one went over, I think, 3,200 hours or something like that. And the crack in the crankcase got big enough that he was just making too big of a mess that he quit flying that engine. What you teach every pilot, and especially gyroplanes too, is the engine is not required equipment. You need to keep a place to land. You don't need that engine to land safely. As long as you fly where you've got a place to land.
What is the engines? You mentioned some name brands.
It's Rotex.
3-cylinder, 2-cylinder?
Oh, these are 4-cylinder, 4-cycle. They are dry sump. They're oil reservoir outside the sump, outside the crankcase. And these are water cooled, oil cooled, and fin cooled. Air. There's a radiator. The oil and water are cooled by radiator stuff, and there's fins on the cylinders. They look a lot like regular airplane engines, but they're built like car engines with the tolerances of cars.
They're really cool engines.
Yeah, a lot of the original planes like Thorpe's and RVs and all are using Rotex engines.
Oh yeah, almost everything uses Rotex, and it's the biggest engine manufacturer in the world, those engines. And they're the safest ones, most reliable ones.
Is there anything built with the old Volkswagen engine?
Well, there's experimentals that are flying with them. Half Volkswagen, they cut them in half and make 2 cylinders out of them, or leave them 4 cylinders. That used to be the thing. And original gyrocopters, they had all kinds of engines. I don't know what Ken Wallace is using there, but he tried about any engine that he could find. Motorcycle engines, and a lot of stuff. Yeah, and Magni went into the mid-90s. They actually paid a Italian engine designer manufacturer to design a 2-cycle 4-cylinder engine for him. It turned out to be very unreliable. A lot of other aircraft bought that engine, and it turned out to be unreliable for them too. And then Rotex came along, had enough hours on their engines that was showing how reliable they were, and so they switched to it, which made them much more expensive. But what do you want, safety or expense? When I mentioned the reliability of the engines, a friend of mine who was the head of the FAA in St. Louis, this is kind of the way we worked. I knew him from his brother, but I needed to get a commercial and instructor rating when I started dealing these things. And so I talked to him, and he could be an instructor, but he wasn't certified in that type of gyroplane. He was certified in a different type. So he couldn't really train me. So he asked, where was I trained? I said, well, I was trained in the factory in Italy. So he says, well, okay, that's good enough. So I trained him, and in training him, we switched back and forth quite a bit. Him in the front seat, me in the back and stuff. We switched around, and we just flew for a lot of fun. And one day, Larry comes down to Perryville. He's in St. Louis, and he comes in an unusual direction. I said, he didn't come like from St. Louis. He came from like the Mississippi River. I said, well, how'd you get down here? He said, I flew the Mississippi River at 10 feet the whole way. And nothing illegal about it unless you get close to boats or something. But I said, Larry, what if the engine quits? He says, I checked that engine, it's foolproof. And he's the head of the FAA. I said, okay, you know, Larry, sometimes engines can quit.
You say certification, what is that?
Well, a pilot certification, a pilot's license.
Okay.
I had to get a commercial pilot's license. It's like a commercial truck driving license.
To fly this?
No, I didn't need.
Okay.
At that time, I didn't need anything. I could fly it by myself legally. But
To be a flight instructor.
yeah, to be a flight. I wanted to be a flight instructor. I had to have a commercial rating, and then I had to get a flight instructor rating on top of that.
I see.
And that's what these guys have done too.
Anything on the radios that you use, do you have to be certified?
Not anymore.
Okay.
Used to be you had to have a radio license, but
The old CB radio, huh? Yeah.
well, we used to use CB radios with our ultralights and stuff. We used CB radios a lot, but not anymore. Yeah, yeah. Should I tell them about our wedding? Well, we weren't into gyroplanes. Maybe we did have a gyroplane, but we had a two-seat ultralight airplane. It's wide open, just one wing and stuff. And we decided to get married at our house in the air. So we were flying. We left the St. Genevieve airstrip down here, and buddies of ours were there, and everybody was putting streamers on their wings and stuff, you know. And so we all flew out to the house. And her brother's on CB, and we're talking on CB. We had a camera taped to the nose, stuff like that. She was in a dress, I was in a suit of some sort. And we had hired a preacher that did unusual weddings. She agreed to do this unusual wedding. But we didn't know who she was, what she looked like or anything. Well, we're in the air. Her brother's talking to us on the radio. Preacher's not here yet. Preacher's not, and we had put just enough gas in it that we could go there, fly around a little bit, and then go back. I put just a little bit of gas because I might want to land there, and then I want to take back off again. But anyway, he's saying, the preacher's not here yet. Well, I had a friend of mine from work, a black guy, him and his wife, they pulled up in a van, and they had their van all full of balloons to let loose. Well, anyway, Chris, her brother, thought, that's got to be her. That's got to be the preacher. So he runs up and grabs her and, come on, they're going to run out of gas. You got to get this going. She had to convince him she wasn't the preacher. But we're circling around and talking to Chris, and we're pretty close to I-55, and who comes on the CB is a truck driver who figured out what's going on, and he wouldn't let that frequency go. He was going to spoil this wedding. So we got a code to her brother, his birthday or something, to switch to that channel, and we went to a channel. We had a free channel, and it all worked out. The preacher got there, married us in the air, and we flew back to the airstrip, and one of our friends, all streamers and stuff, they flew around for a while, and he did some aerobatics and landed and kept the crowd interested until we got back.
You did used to land in your yard or field inside your house for a while.
Yeah, that's what we did in the ultralights, yeah. But when neighbors moved in, we haven't done that much.
They didn't like it very much for some reason. I
don't know. They like it when Paul landed in the front yard in helicopters all the time. Yeah. Anybody else? Hope you enjoyed a little bit of this. Now you know what you're seeing up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us here at the Museum Learning Center. And take a few minutes and take a quick peek around if you like. seen it.
Nice job.
I saw